I've been working in the media industry for about 20 years, mainly working in broadcast innovation for companies like Aardman Features and the BBC. And I joined Dropbox nearly 2 years ago because I saw the massive potential that it had for the media industry and because I wanted to help creative businesses to adapt and thrive in an evolving media model. Now, we've taken on an even more important role over the last few months, helping the media industry to continue to operate in very challenging circumstances. And I wanted to start by talking about some of the examples of successful media companies who are working from home, then look at Dropbox tools and how we're helping teams to work from home. And finally, we're going to hear from our friends at Exposure, an amazing creative agency, about how they're using Dropbox for their campaigns and what it means for their teams. Now, today I'm going to focus on some lessons that I've learned from working with global media and content companies. And I'm going to concentrate today on companies that have changed their businesses to work from home completely, because I think that's going to be most useful for all of us. Now, for many of us, working in a regular office has become, the norm, but when we're removed from that environment, it can be a bit of a shock. But perhaps we shouldn't forget that for a lot of media staff, for reporters, for producers, for crews, well, they haven't ever really got used to having a permanent office. And when you think about it, if you're making natural history documentaries, the penguins very rarely want to come into your offices or into your studios to be filmed. But of course, now we're not talking just about those ultra remote shoots. We're talking about local productions and how you can work with audiences and your own teams when they're working from home offices. Now, for campaigns and projects, over the last 10, 15 years, they've become much more global thanks to the broad reach of social media and how having a campaign that disseminates across different regions actually takes a lot more planning. So while we're all used to connecting with teams across the world, we have to be really thoughtful about that. So the fact that I'm based in the UK doesn't mean that I'm not working every day with the teams in New York, in San Francisco, or with a media team actually down in Australia who are supporting large companies down there. Now, the reality for all of us is that time zones just disappear now. And we're becoming used to learning how to work together asynchronously. So obviously, if you're working in news, you're already covering breaking stories, and they happen whenever they happen. So it doesn't really matter where you are; those stories are happening in that space. And for global advertising campaigns, localization and territory-based editorial, well, that's all about how you drive excellence in those local markets. So I thought it'd be really useful to start off with an example that we can all learn from. We've been working with a company in the US called Fullscreen. Now, they're a branded content company who we've been working with for a little while now. They started out as an influencer management company, and then they expanded into a branded content organization. And what's really interesting about Fullscreen, who were acquired recently by Warner Media, is that they started as a remote agency from the get-go. Now they've got about 500 staff, and they all worked remotely. Now, their founder was really, really passionate that in starting up the agency, creativity isn't about bricks and mortar. And I think that's something that's really interesting for us all to be reflecting on, certainly to see how our businesses have changed over the last 3 months. But it's a trend that we at Dropbox have been monitoring actually for about 18 months. More and more marketing and branded content companies have been moving teams to work remotely, or certainly working in a new dispersed way. And perhaps pertinently, over the last kind of 3 months, obviously remote working has become a reality for all of us. So what I thought would be useful is to talk about some of the important lessons that Fullscreen had learned, and they were very kind to share them with us. So our friends at Fullscreen, they kind of came up with some best practice tips, but also some pitfalls to watch out for. And it's really good to reflect on how you're doing as a company against what they learned over running their agency for so long in a remote way. Now, they boil it down to 3 main things that you can't compromise on when creating a remote culture. The first one is communication. Now, in a remote environment, as we've all learned, timely responses and clear communication are key. And company culture, therefore, is often learned from the top down. So you need to reinforce the way that you expect people to behave is the way that you're going to behave in the tools that you use. So if you're a leader in a new remote working environment, leading those campaigns, remember to remain an active participant in your Slack channels or whatever messaging tools that you're using. And you need to respond in a timely manner to those direct messages so that you're making sure that the team constantly have that direction, but everybody is accessible, because no one can walk over to your desk anymore. So it's about being accessible to your team. And remember that the way that you communicate will dictate the way that your company communicates. So really set that example. Now, the second tip they told us was about calendars. And I think we've all got to become much better at managing them and experts in Outlook or in GCal, because without the ability to see if someone's over there sitting at their desk or making a coffee, the calendar is going to be the thing that sets your agenda. But it's not just about your agenda, it's about showing your colleagues when you're open and when you're available. And that openness, well, it's important to have the flip side of it. It's important to show when you can't be contacted, when you need that focus time, when you need to get on with your work. So it's starting to get much more open about your calendar process and much more rigid about when you need focus time and when you don't. That's the second thing that they told us. And then most importantly, for creative content development is context. And this is really important because if you're working in editorial and brand teams, there's always going to have to be an editorial position. And when there's no ability to just stop and chat at someone's desk, you need to make sure that your teams know exactly what's going on at the start of a campaign and of a project. You need to have that two-way dynamic with the client to make sure that they know the why behind every ask, because that context is really going to help to keep your content on message. Now, of course, remote production's all about changing the way that teams work together. And if you think about it, media's always been a kind of a pass the parcel approach. It's always been about multiple teams working together, from lots of different companies and freelancers. So whether it's still images, tapes, now digital files, that content gets handed from a camera operator into an editor, then to an exec to sign it off, client sign off, review, feedback. That workflow is really achieved using collaboration tools today. So that's Adobe, Dropbox, Zoom and Slack. It's kind of a creative Swiss Army knife of collaboration, if you will. And whether it's pitch building or delivering finished programs for editorial checking, it's really important to bring all of that together and to make sure that the team can work flexibly together on it. So if those are the tips of how we can work together well, let's reflect then on some of the unavoidable challenges, because I think we've all encountered some of these. The first one is technical challenges. Now, they're going to be unavoidable because all of a sudden we've moved from offices with really fast connectivity and IT support teams there to help us to working at home, connecting on our home connections when potentially there's lots of other people in the neighborhood needing to share that bandwidth with us. So we're having to juggle this complexity of dealing with bandwidth. And when we surveyed some Australian marketing agencies recently, the number one issue that they came up with was the challenge of managing bandwidth. And why do they have a challenge with managing bandwidth? Because they're dealing with so many large files, so huge image files, huge video files and audio files. So managing that bandwidth, we know, is a bit of a challenge. And we've built some tools that I'll talk about shortly that can help you to do that. Now, the second area is around timelines and being really, really clear about what the deadlines are for a project and what needs to be delivered at different states. And particularly that's important if you're working across time zones as well, because clearly your teams are going to be able to work at different points. But now those teams who are working from home may have other responsibilities during the day. For example, they might be looking after children in the morning and homeschooling. So they might be working later on into the evening, which could work if you're a European company that collaborates with a US company. You might actually be able to align your time zones more. But one thing's for sure, we're getting much more used to asynchronous working. And having creative collaboration platforms that let you do that is really, really important. So I can leave comments, I can leave actions for you that you can then pick up and move on to the next piece of work. And finally, calls. Calls. I think we've all got used to much more communication, much more webinars, web meetings, online chats, because actually that face-to-face connection that we would have traditionally on a production, on location or in the office, we're going to have to replicate that. And so If you see more calls coming into your diary, which I think we all have been over the last 3 months, then it shows actually that the system's working because people are communicating more and they're getting used to it. So that's a really important one. But of course, when we talk about calls, we're mainly talking about video calls so that we can read that body language and trying to understand what's really going on but behind the ask. So that's a really important thing, keeping the video on. And finally, Fullscreen shared this amazing vision of how they work together, but ultimately they call out the most important professional skill of the future is trust. And when you think about it, trust is something that holds everything together when you work remotely. It allows team members to feel autonomous, to just get on with what they think is important, but it also creates a sense of support for all of your employees. And it allows them to ask questions, to challenge things, which is difficult when you're remote because you can't have that same kind of creative debate. And it also allows them to dream big. And that's something that we all really need today. Those amazing ideas that take, advantage of constrained resources, but actually think creatively in a very different way. And I would like to reflect on that about how we work as teams as well. Because when we think about our new workplaces and how we work, I think it's really important to think back to the ethos of kind of team sports and how we're taught as children really to work together. And very often, media teams replicate sports teams. It's about being out in the open. It's about shooting those amazing ads. It's about that amazing cinematic view. But it's a team coming together to go and make something amazing out in the open. And that's where we think a lot of those sports metaphors really kind of play into this idea of teamwork. But of course, that physical kind of teams metaphor doesn't really exist anymore. Today, teams are working in a very different way. And I think it's important to look at where we've seen this work well. Young people entering the workforce, so, fresh graduates and kind of early stage careers, they've literally been trained to work together remotely by playing together in esports, online games, getting creative, solving problems, getting things done. And for all of us, these are the new teams, and there's no choice but to embrace it. And so what's interesting is starting to see companies kind of using these younger, kind of very, very digitally savvy remote workers who are absolutely about that virtual collaboration, reverse mentoring their colleagues and helping to coach colleagues and sharing, this is what really works well. You could try this. This is what's going to be great. And it's really interesting about how we're seeing the workplace evolve as those relationships start to build. Now, as you might imagine, for Dropbox, we've been quite busy during this period. And we've got a couple of tips that we just want to give you that will help you to think about how you can cope in these lower bandwidth conditions. Now, the first thing that we'd recommend is that you install the Dropbox Smart Sync client and use that to keep all your documents in sync. Now, this is really important because it allows you to have all of your documents in the cloud, but synchronize the ones that you're working on locally on your machine. So when you look at the Finder window there, you can see some videos that have got a little green tick next to them. And that means that content is synchronized and local on my computer. But you have some other documents that have got a little cloud icon. Now I can still see that those documents exist. I can see what they are. They're a contract or a release form, but actually they're kept up in Dropbox in the cloud. And that idea of enabling me to have some content locally, but actually most of the content remotely, means that I can maximize my hard drive space if I'm working on, say, a video editing project. So I can make sure I've got the content on my machine that I need. So that's a really important one. Now, a clever part of Smart Sync is something called Delta Sync. And what this enables you to do when you've got that Smart Sync client running on your computer is it enables you to only upload the differences in files. So if you're editing a huge Photoshop file, maybe it's a gig, maybe it's more than that, and you only make a tiny change, maybe you paint out a couple of pixels, you don't want to have to upload that whole gigabyte of data again. So with Dropbox Smart Sync, what we do is that we only upload the changes. So actually, if you've only changed a tiny amount of information, maybe you've got a film and you only changed 2 or 3 frames in that, then what we'll do is we'll only actually synchronize the changes. So that helps you to be really, really efficient with your bandwidth when working from home, but only changing the differences. So it's going to make your working much faster, and it's really going to help kind of get to those deliveries much quicker as well. Now, we've been working with a large broadcaster in the US who've literally picked up their laptops and walked out the building with very, very little impact on their output. And that was thanks to the sync engine, because they make their edits, they make their changes, and then it's synchronized into their playout center, and they can then just get that content to air. So it's really interesting to see how something very simple like the synchronization engine is having a big impact on media teams working in post-production. Now, my second tip really is about installing Dropbox Spaces. Now, this is our newest product, and this is really going to speed up your productivity. Now, that same folder that we were looking at before, well, this is what it looks like on Dropbox Spaces. It looks completely different. And that's because we built Dropbox Spaces to be a team space where you can bring your tools, your teams, and your content together. Now, it was designed with distributed teams in mind, and it really helps on creative projects, because if you have a look, there's the title of the folder at the top, and underneath that, there's a description, there's some context. That means everybody who's working on this project can understand this is what the campaign's about, and here's the deliverables. And then beneath that, you can see a number of to-do lists, and I can tag people in it. So all of a sudden, just in a simple folder, I've got the ability to set the context, to add some to-dos, to ask people to do them, and then below that, you can see I can pin the most important documents. So any new team member joining the team can then see, hey, these are the 4 most important things I should be reading, I should be looking at for this production. And then below that, that's where the files are actually there. So if you think about it, we've kind of reinvented how the folder works. And I think that's really important in thinking about how we work as teams, about ways that we can work together asynchronously, set tasks, see comments on files, see feedback, and bring that all together. And you can also launch your kind of collaboration tools of choice like Slack and Zoom directly from Dropbox Spaces. So you can pull content, send it straight into a video conference, straight from within Dropbox. And again, that's really about trying to keep all your focus on keeping the production going, keeping that campaign flowing, not having to jump between lots of different tools. You can just start it straight away. So if that's some of the practices we're seeing for those who are working from home, and how we at Dropbox have got some tips for you on how you can make things a little bit easier, I think it's important to also think about how our audiences and society are changing, and therefore what that means for the campaigns of tomorrow. So we're really pleased to have the team from Exposure with us to take us through the challenges and the changes that they're seeing the industry's facing, but also their tactics to how they're helping their teams to keep working, no matter where they are. So I'm really pleased to be joined by 2 of Exposure's leaders to hear more about the work that they're doing, hear about their thinking and the future of campaigns. So we're joined today by co-founder Rahul Shah and with head of IT, Ben Stratton-Woodward. So welcome both of you guys. Thanks so much for being involved. Before we get into some of the details, let's see some of your campaigns in action. We're really lucky to have Rahul with us. And so Rahul, tell us about Exposure and how you approach creative projects.
Thanks very much, Andy. Nice to see you. Exposure was founded in 1993, and we are a creative communications agency working out of offices in London, Paris, and New York. We talk about our purpose as being here to make brands culturally relevant, and we work across a multitude of different sectors with brands such as Nike, Coca-Cola, Levi's, Microsoft, Samsung, Lego, Dr. Martens, and a number of others. And in general, what we are always endeavoring to do is to find ways that culture can enhance the dialogue and conversation brands want to have with consumers, and through that relationship, generate opportunities to build communities, build commercial value, and create more interesting positions for brands in what is generally a very overcrowded consumer marketplace.
Well, I think that's a great background of kind of fresh look at things, because today's session is really about what's next and what's keeping your teams on track. Now, I know that you're running a series of inside exposure sessions to look at the emerging themes for consumers and for advertisers. But part one of that session was really to look at how you can develop ideas for the future. So how are your teams focusing on that?
Well, I think, we've adapted in a way that I think nobody anywhere in the world imagined was possible, which is that we've gone from a sort of a normal day at work to a very not normal series of weeks and now months working from home. And that in itself has shed a lot of light on our working practice. I think in any industry, whatever kind of business you're in, we've realized that not only have we been incredibly agile and able to adapt, but we've also been very, very fast. The idea of being able to fast forward and move at pace, despite the fact that suddenly we have not got the sort of perhaps cushion of being in offices surrounded by lots of people and lots of kind of support infrastructure, has actually freed us up to be instinctive, to make decisions, and to perhaps put, our creative endeavor further up the sort of priority list of how we behave. And so, there's been some quite incredible examples of how, we have managed to adapt and work in the face of sort of crisis and disruption. And I think one of the things that's very clear to me is that we've all sat in many sessions where we've done medium-term planning. We've looked ahead at sort of year 1, year 2, or longer sort of term horizon planning. And suddenly we're looking at how we can accelerate things and bring them forward whereby, we always have this sort of, proverbial parking lot for ideas that aren't for now, but for the future. Well, today we think if there's only one thing everyone should be doing is going through those ideas and looking at which ones any organization is able to fast forward and bring right up into the present. Because right now, I think, it's really the time for brands to be looking at how they can leverage the proliferation, of digital technology and bring ideas forward that might have merit now and be a sort of a roadmap for how businesses will operate in the future.
Well, I think that's a really interesting idea, and we're going to hear later on about how you're pivoting ideas for creative campaigns. But thinking about the wider market, what successful pivots are happening in this space today?
Well, I mentioned speed and agility, and I guess, from the sort of fear and the unknown that we've all been kind of, confronted with, from that comes learning and growth. And that learning and growth has allowed and, forced us really to sort of think about what are we all going to do to address the new economy. And, businesses have now had to contend with a complete freeze in revenue. Stores have been closed, so for consumer brands that has been a huge swathe of retail that has just been switched off, and as a result one has to sort of start looking at what that's telling us in terms of the road to recovery. And I think in terms of growth opportunities, what we've seen is a number of many brands doing some quite incredible things by really just resetting the existing infrastructure they've got. So if you take a brand like Lululemon, they have a very big digital community already, but they also have a number of retail stores, all of which were closed, like many others. And so in their case, they took their community of employees, and their staff were actually referred to as educators, and they refocused their time to the consumer who was now finding himself or herself at home. And by offering a series of different at-home solutions to workout, mindfulness, yoga practice, etc., what they've done is they've created and continue to build the bond between educator and community, and therefore continue to have the brand present in a non-physical way. And through that, that's had a direct impact on their e-commerce, and they've actually seen sales grow. And so the combination of sort of commerce, e-commerce, with entertainment mixed with the actual practice and sort of use of what their purpose is as a business has been incredibly successful. And I think, that's already provided them with a direction of travel for what their revenue model might be looking like in the future, even when the stores reopen.
I think that's a really interesting idea, to build on community and entertainment at the same time. How do you think that businesses will be creatively driving through the next few months then?
Well, I think, the question businesses have to ask is, what are we going to do differently? How are we going to look at our sort of comeback strategy? And, what are we going to do that will, secure the next, few years, next decades? Because what we were doing in many cases is either going to be less resonant, less relevant, less important. And I think that sort of takes us to a place where businesses have to start by thinking about, human scale and trust. I think we've realized that our values around community, localization, belonging has been enhanced by what we've all just been experiencing and continue to experience. So, brands will need to put a much bigger human touch to the way they communicate. I think they're going to be, having to demonstrate more empathy. They're going to need to show genuinely what they stand for, what their values are, and how they can add meaning and enhance, positive lifestyles for consumers. And I think, when you take that away from the economics of business, you start seeing brands already behaving in a way where they are improving, the social and environmental space that we occupy. And Apple, for example, are building town squares. Nike have launched their Adventure Club for kids, which is quite transformational as a platform for that brand and their community. And I think, the backdrop to all of this is that we are currently, looking and know that we have the largest youth population in world history. And those young people are going to be emerging from these experiences with a completely different set of references and values. And, the idea of sort of being activist is normal for young people. It's not something you just decide to do one day. And I think with what's going on in the world today and what has been going on since the outbreak of COVID, but all the other environmental factors like politics as well, I think it's going to be very, very important for brands to think about how they're going to start putting a stronger voice, which will unite and align them with communities, and really let young people have a bigger say in forming the sort of agenda and future sort of journeys that brands want if they're going to remain resonant and relevant for business.
I think those are amazing insights, and the reality is that to that point around youth populations having seen things that none of us would imagine anybody would have to see in their lifestyle, and then those formative experiences going on into their early stage careers and where they go in the world. I think we're going to see an amazing shift in the kind of resilience of young people. What I'd like to switch to is the team that have been supporting now all of those creative workflows, to Ben, who's the head of IT for Exposure. Now, Ben, thanks so much for joining us. Tell us about how you've been supporting your teams to work remotely.
Hi, Andy. Yeah, well, there's been quite a large shift in the kind of IT support requests my team have been getting, and the tech team would normally spend quite large amounts of time supporting things like equipment and monitors and peripherals and actually moving staff around. But surprisingly now, my team are much more involved in the technical delivery of client work, especially where client-facing staff are trying to leverage new technologies to try and replace this inability for our clients' customers to physically gather. We've recently had a good example of that with one of the biggest manufacturers of mobile phones in the world, who's one of our clients. And they've asked us to provide some content for their website to replace the sessions that were previously physically taking place in their flagship store. So the client-facing team had to pivot, and the client had to pivot from their original delivery position. And so what we did was gather, get some Instagram influencers and talent to to provide content for these online sessions that were replacing the Flagstore sessions. And our role was to help gathering the footage, which was actually quite large, the film footage, and it was tricky to traverse because it was such a large set of files, because film files are notoriously big. So we sort of got around that problem by sending them a Dropbox file request to simplify that process, and also enabled our team to have the footage filed exactly where we specified it in the file request invitation, because that's how the product works. So just by right-clicking, the folder there where you want the files, to arrive in the request, and then an invitation gets sent out to the recipient, and a simple upload link is generated for them to just upload the file. And so we tested this on the actual mobile devices of the client that they manufacture. So we didn't know if that would work, but actually it was quite successful. And it's best to have it's successful because you're having the talent focus on the creative work they're doing and the content, and using up that goodwill in that area, rather than challenging to try and overcome fairly arbitrary tasks.
Yeah, that's obviously where you give that creative the opportunity to concentrate on telling their story, having their creative vision realized, rather than worried about how do I shift all these ones and zeros from this device to your edit team. I think that's a really good way to think about how you can let people express their creativity and not have to worry about some of the technical challenges that we spoke about earlier. But thinking about those challenges, what has been the biggest challenges in keeping the wheels turning?
Well, keeping the wheels turning hasn't been too much trouble, and that has been a big issue. To give it some context, we were at around the time of the lockdown, we were at our final stage of our Dropbox migration, and to be precise, a week before we decided to at the same time to deliver Microsoft Teams to about 150 people remaining in our teams who didn't have that, 30 laptops so people could work from home, and we had scheduled a Dropbox migration, and we had to sort of stubbornly keep that in place because we knew that would play into our hands if there was a work from home scenario. So we migrated one of the largest sort of client-facing teams of about 70 staff on the Monday of the lockdown that it was announced. So it was the digital equivalent of Indiana Jones diving underneath a descending door and grabbing his hat in the nick of time. So talk about good timing.
That's really interesting. And so how far do you think you can push things? Because obviously you've got teams that were very reliant on having an amazing support in the office. Now they're not there. How far do you think things can go?
That's a good question. I think you can go quite far, and I think we've become quite dexterous at these migrations now because these are the use of the product and our abilities and so forth. But I think a good example was we had a member of the HR team a couple of days before the lockdown. We were telling teams go home and check your laptop works when you go home. So that if we're on having to work from home, you're all set up. So we had one particular HR member just having no luck with their VPN whatsoever, kept coming back every day, nope, still not working. So in the end, we decided that it was easier to migrate her entire team, which was only about 4 people, because they weren't on Dropbox yet, to migrate her team instead of spending more time fixing her VPN. So it was a better investment in time to just migrate her entire team and work around the problem in that way. So but yeah, and since then we've had a much greater focus on doing these migrations, if you like, online. So with the US staff, we're now doing all the migrations, with online meetings. It's actually more successful. You can gather people much easier online and get things done quite quickly because there's a greater appetite for online meetings now, and so that's really played into our hands. And I think generally speaking, the learning curve for technology has increased in the last 2 months. So my opinion is, it's a perfect time to enhance your technology in your business. If you're thinking about whether to do more technology, release productivity software, or do more with Teams or Dropbox, and you're not sure whether now's a good time to do it because people might be overwhelmed. Actually, people's workers have strengthened that muscle. They're really adept at getting to grips with new technology. So my advice is, throw it at them, and most circumstances they're crying out for it.
I think that's something we're hearing from a lot of different parts of the creative industry, is that the show must go on is often a much overused term, but it's absolutely true, is that people are creative. Producers, program makers, they're intrinsically want to deliver the most amazing project, and they're incredibly creative about how they actually get there. So I think you're right. The ability to just try something, a little fix that just solves this one thing here. If that makes us 5% better or makes it look better, then absolutely we're willing to give it a go, because it's all about entertaining the audience, all about that experience, giving them an amazing piece of content that's really going to delight them. And thinking about that, so for all those marketeers, for those creatives and producers out there, thinking about how to flex your approach to make things work remotely, I'd really love to kind of finish before we go to Q&A on some top tips. So I think it's most important. Let's start with the creative. So Raul, what are your top 3 creative tips to really keep an agency creative when no one's together?
I'm sure if you ask me this question tomorrow and next week, it would change, but I'm going to give you 3 top tips I have as of now. And I guess, like a lot of things in real time, we're evolving, adapting and learning as we go. But one thing that is absolutely key, which actually I'm stealing from our legal counsel actually, is this idea of movement. It's very easy to not move. We are bound sometimes to our various environments that we're working in, whether it's a kitchen table or in a bedroom or in a lounge. And if we haven't all got a working environment at home, which many people haven't got, quite understandably, it's important for our own individual kind of mind and creative sort of openness to move. And that means moving physically, walking, running, cycling, but getting out and genuinely giving yourself a break. And I think that's absolutely key. And it's amazing how at the beginning it was very easy to forget to move. We were literally sat here for hours on end, just trying to get through call after call after call. So that would be my first one. Don't forget to move. Really give yourself a break. The second thing is, I think we have to learn to really embrace what I would call imperfect action. I think the 21st century landscape is going to be defined by a very different type of business to the ones that maybe we're used to from the past. And what I mean by that is that we've got to be prepared to embrace the imperfections. We've got to learn in real time. I think tech companies do it brilliantly. They learn and evolve, and they're adapting, and software updates are happening all the time. Physical companies that make products and objects are sometimes bound by their structure. And I think structure isn't going to be the way forward, because we'll need a combination of structure and fluidity, and that has to allow for imperfection. So the second thing, I think, if you're a creative or if you're in business, and I think all business is creative, I don't think there's any ownership of creativity on one side. One can dial it up, but basically you've got to embrace imperfection and then learn from that and see what that teaches you. And then the final thing is from a talk I did recently with an artist who talked about this sort of idea of constant practice, like tiny little daily routines of practicing something. It could be anything. It could be learning to cook from scratch. So as you said, just learn to make better eggs on toast, but do it every day and improve it as you go, rather than trying to go, right, I'm going to overnight or in the next 6 weeks of lockdown, I'm going to learn to play a musical instrument. Rather than giving yourself those mountains to climb, a small amount of constant practice is a really valuable thing for, the long term.
That's brilliant. I mean, I think they're phenomenal creative visions, and I love the idea of getting better at making eggs on toast as well. Ben, what's your tech vision for success then? How are you, what have you learned from this process?
I think my top 3 tips, I'd probably start with thinking about heroes. Expect new heroes, I would say. There'll be a different kind of hero anyway, because the result of not sitting next to someone all the time to generate ideas and bounce off and collaborate, we'll see workers who are, more capable of working on their own will probably rise to the surface a bit more. and as a result, be prepared for different different kind of output, because ideas are generated differently now. And my second one would be listening. The very nature of online meetings means that technology is not nuanced for people to talk at the same time, or multiple people to talk at the same time. And I think people have learned to listen more as a result of that. And I think people hopefully will take that into other parts of their lives, and certainly creative ideas will be generated in a more considered way, I hope. And that the best ideas are often normally comes about as a result of being said the most or shouted the loudest in a brainstorm. And I think that will change. And I think those thoughts and ideas will be more considered, and people will listen more. And my final one, I think, is really important. That's just be kind. Everyone is undergoing a massive change, extra stresses, more enclosed spaces, and heightened restrictions. So be nicer to people. You don't know what they're going through, and your kindness can really help. So not just in business, but at home with your partner, your parents, and especially your colleagues who working the hardest they can for you. So do real proactive things around that. Have online meetings that don't have business objectives. Ask how your fellow teammates are doing for money, and go the extra mile. One of the things I've been doing recently is, instead of getting a courier to send a keyboard or mouse, I jump on my bike and I take one myself during my lunch break, get a bit of exercise, and put a little chocolate in there and a little note to say hi, and if I can, sort of distance and see them. And nothing else. I get a lot out of it. It's really gratifying.
What an amazing way to end, and what an amazing journey over the last 27 years. And it's great to see that flexibility of thinking about how you're approaching campaigns, but as well as the tools that you're giving to your teams and how you're supporting them. And I think it's always great to end on such a positive message of being kind. And that's something that's incredibly vital, that all of us just keep at the heart of this, is that, that's what we need to be, no matter what the situation we're in. So it's with that, thanks to Raoul and Ben, and we look forward to taking your questions.